I selected these artists, I brought them to the University of Virginia. Each of them had been affected by hurricanes Harvey, Irma, or Maria, and they displayed their art and they talked about what the role of art is amid climate disaster. And so I've been working for a couple of years with some digital humanities collaborators to launch a digital art exhibit, also called Coasts in Crisis, which you can see here on my screen. So I invite you to check it out and to really think today about what is the role of art and artists in confronting a warmer, wetter planet. Today, I know that we have a lot of different stakeholders at this conference, so I'm going to try to use very little academic literary jargon, and I want to make my work clear as I talk about how art really addresses the overlapping, imbricated disasters taking place in Puerto Rico right now. So let's get started, right? Welcome to the oldest colony. So reads a mural painted in swirling cursive on a wall in Old San Juan. In this most heavily visited neighborhood of Puerto Rico, the English language phrase reminds tourists that the island archipelago belongs to, but is not part of, the United States. That phrase, Puerto Rico belongs to, but is not part of, the United States, appears in a series of early 20th century Supreme Court legal decisions known as the Insular Cases that define Puerto Rico as an unincorporated territory of the United States. So while Anglophone tourists might be surprised to learn that the island remains a de facto colony, I think this mural might also be directed at Puerto Ricans themselves, right, as a form of indignant protest against the seemingly anachronistic and inherently unstable status of an island whose residents carry US passports and yet do not enjoy all the privileges of American citizenship. So the murals that you see here today were painted by anonymous students of the School of Plastic Arts in Puerto Rico who declare themselves to be in resistance, right, to the contemporary situation in Puerto Rico. And so these wall paintings aim to use arte para vencer, or art to overcome the challenges facing the island. These challenges are myriad, unfortunately. Puerto Rico is in the throes of an economic, social, and political crisis that's more than a decade old. The immediate cause of this dire economic situation is the island's public debt, which is now estimated to be $70 billion. How is it possible that an island that has about 3 million people has a debt of $70 billion, right? In brief, since the early part of the century, hedge funds and speculative so-called vulture funds, which are based outside of Puerto Rico, have bought up the island's municipal debts for pennies on the dollar, and now those investors are insisting on repayment of that debt in full. I'm not an economist, but I would point you towards the Puerto Rico syllabus as a way to understand better how debt has long been a tool of colonial oppression and control in the Caribbean. So in what Marisol Lebron has called the return of a more explicit form of American colonial rule to the island, under the new PROMESA, or Puerto Rico Management and Stability Act, Puerto Rico is now essentially governed by an unelected 7-member fiscal oversight and management board, which is known in Spanish as La Junta Fiscal, with all of the dictatorial overtones that the word junta carries with it. So beginning in 2017, the Junta Fiscal imposed waves of austerity measures, including reductions in healthcare, education, public services, government pensions, and the deeply anti-democratic nature of the situation sparked large protests across the island and in the diaspora. And in this, I include, the current and ongoing struggle to resist further budget cuts at the University of Puerto Rico, which has long been a wellspring of political resistance. Okay. So no disaster is ever completely natural or unnatural. They're all cobbled together from massive amounts of injustice and human error, right? So several months after this Junta Fiscal was put into place in 2017, Hurricanes Irma and Maria hit Puerto Rico in the fall, right? August and September of 2017. The government's failed response to the damage drove home the island's colonial status and its relative abandonment by the United States. Right? In the summer of 2018, local and federal officials were still claiming that Hurricane Maria had caused only 64 deaths, while a study that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine conservatively estimated that more than 4,000 people died as a direct or indirect result of the storm. This disparity between the local administration's death count and the professional study reveals an official repudiation of Puerto Rican lives, right? This governmental diminishment of human suffering was embodied in 2017 by President Trump's very callous gesture of tossing paper towels at hurricane survivors, while most of the residents of Puerto Rico were living without water and without power. And just as an aside, as I've been looking at art from Puerto Rico in the last several years, I would say that a full 70% of it has a paper towel motif. So artists have really picked up on paper towels as sort of an emblematic moment of disrespect there. So in response to the government's low death toll, hundreds of Puerto Ricans placed pairs of shoes belonging to their deceased loved ones on the steps of the Capitol building. Right, so this kind of performance art serves as a physical manifestation of the official failure to account for lives lost in the storm. As the Puerto Rican artist Antonio Martorell declared in the catalog for his exhibit about the uncounted dead in Maria, he said, "Those who deny death doubly deny life." The institutional disrespect for Puerto Rican citizens has also been writ large in their relief policies. Recent studies by economists have shown that the island has received less aid more slowly than other states affected by 2017 hurricanes Irma and Harvey in the US South, including in Louisiana and in Texas. This has left an impoverished population on the island more vulnerable than the populations on the mainland. And the ongoing implementation of austerity measures amid the insufficient storm response constitutes a pernicious example of what Naomi Klein has called the shock doctrine of disaster capitalism. As a direct result of these two overlapping crises, the vast majority of Puerto Ricans on the island are experiencing a decrease in their standard of living. As another student mural that you see here in Old San Juan proclaims in Spanish, promesa is poverty, right? So we're not surprised by the great out-migration away from Puerto Rico into the mainland United States. Nevertheless, in this oldest colony in the world, in which residents lack control over many aspects of their own political, economic, and ecological futures, art converges with social justice activism as a means for Puerto Ricans to make their voices heard in the public sphere. And they have achieved some very significant gains. In July 2019, Governor Ricardo Rosselló resigned in the face of massive demonstrations against his treatment of his fellow Puerto Ricans and the regulations of the Junta Fiscal. Art and music have emerged as key modes of refuting the discounting of Puerto Rican lives by the colonial government. However, I want to argue today that the most powerful contemporary art does not just call the people to attention and to action. The art is action itself, right? An action that reclaims, restores, and revalorizes Puerto Rican lives and landscapes. So today I'm going to focus on the art of and activities of Daniel Lindramos, who's a Puerto Rican artist, and how he models the ethics and aesthetics of salvage, of repair, and reinvention in contemporary Caribbean art. Right, so I propose that his work can help us to imagine coastal and archipelagic futures in ways that will help us adapt to warmer, wetter worlds, and to do so in a way that happens outside of colonial dynamics and in collaboration with other species. So Daniel Lindramos is a Puerto Rican artist of color based in Loíza, which is an Afro-Puerto Rican community east of San Juan that has a very long history of indigenous and African resistance to colonialism. Lindramos' studio was damaged in the storms. And when I was able to visit him in February 2019, the space was still shadowed by large pieces of plywood where sliding glass doors had once let in light and air, right? Lindramos talked to me about how he sees his work and his art as an extension of his community, which similarly suffered in the storm. His artistic objective, he tells me, is to confront the people of Loíza with their own history. With a $10,000 post-hurricane grant from a local organization called Beta Local, Lindramos is working to establish an art center in his native Loíza. The center will display works by Lindramos, but also by other artists, and it has space for an artist in residence. They'll offer conferences, talks, and gatherings, right? So the new venue is a physical embodiment of the value of Loíza's cultural and artistic heritage. And so I said before that Loíza had a sort of an outsized role in Afro-Puerto Rican and also Taíno cultures, right? Loíza is home to some of the most extensive Taíno archaeological sites in Puerto Rico. And it was a center of enslaved Afro-Puerto Rican resistance to a little remembered British invasion of Puerto Rico in 1797. So today, Loíza struggles with a different kind of invasion, which is white gentrification of this coastal landscape. They also suffer from salt water intrusion into agricultural areas with sea level rise. So the challenges are myriad, but Lindramos is countering metropolitan art culture by cultivating a sense of place, right? Both cultural and ecological, by locating his art center in and for the people of Loíza. So as a whole, Lindramos's body of work insists upon the value of a region that is often denigrated because its Black residents have little access to financial capital. His unique creations, right, are assemblages about 10 to 12 feet high, made out of materials that are often collected for him by local residents. Each assemblage has the aura of an altar surrounded by offerings, which stems from Lin's inspiration in the sculptural bas-reliefs that he studied in Benin. But these assemblages that we see here also syncretize elements of Taíno and Afro-Puerto Rican cultures, including altars to the orishas in the Afro-Caribbean spiritual practice of Santeria and Voodoo. We might want to think of these as multi-species assemblages, ones that consider together human and more than human entities without privileging one over the other, and recognizing that survival amid disaster here is going to rely on multi-species, multi-community collaboration. So as an eco-critical scholar, I'm most interested in Lindramos's use of the palm tree, which is an occurring motif in his assemblages, including this one that you see on the left, which I saw in progress in 2019. So this is a photo I took in his studio. The palm tree's history traces the same roots of colonization and the slave trade from the Pacific to the Caribbean via European empires. The palm in Lindramos's work thus embodies the legacy of forced human and non-human migrations, right? And we can think of the palma real, the royal palm, as sort of the national symbol of Cuba. So palms have a lot of weight in Caribbean culture. The palm, though, also indicates the adaptability of peoples and landscapes in the Caribbean, right? Lindramos nicknames the coconut palms Las Vencedoras, or the victors, based on what we might call their resilience, although I have trouble with that word, so maybe we could call it their resistance, right? The ability of the palm to bend and thus withstand the fierce winds of hurricanes. Lindramos's vision makes it clear that hurricanes, palm trees, and slave ships all traverse the Atlantic from Cape Verde to the Caribbean islands, following these global wind and trade patterns that have shaped the region's environmental, racial, and economic history. So finally, the palm is a multifarious and essential part of Caribbean culture, right? It provides food, drink, oil, textile fibers, shelter with its leaves, and the wood used for construction for artisanal and ritual masks. Lind, with me, simply called the palm an identity. So this piece that you see in progress here later became an installation called Maria Maria that was exhibited at New York's 2019 Whitney Biennial. And since that time, Lind has also been awarded a MacArthur Genius Grant. So I felt honored to have seen his work in advance, right? Maria is an installation piece that's about 7 feet tall here. And at first glance, the installation evokes Catholic Marian statuary, right? This brilliant blue fabric cascades down and folds from the religious figure's head to the floor. But as the viewer approaches, it becomes clear that this shawl is actually a tarp, right? The ubiquitous material that continues to cover many homes destroyed in Hurricane Maria many years after the event. And as I said before, a lot of art includes a paper towel motif. I would say a full 50% of the art that I've seen recently also includes a tarp of some kind. Which I love, right? Lindramos is using this trompe-l'oeil, this tricking the eye technique, and he's playing with the signification of the double name of the piece's title, Maria Maria, right? Maria here is both the nurturing virgin, referring to Catholic imagery, but she's also the ferocious storm. So this Maria is ambivalent, right? Simultaneously destructive and protective, terrifying and embracing. In the assemblage, the palm tree provides the supporting structure and the contrasting material to the tarp, right? You can see here in the center image that Maria's face is a polished coconut, right? And from her head, this burlap bags descend to her shoulders, right? Which taper down into coconuts, which you see at the bottom of the screen. Most important, in Maria Maria, Lindramos has added another layer of meaning to the coconuts you see there by collecting the small pile of them in the metal tub at the base of the installation to represent those who died in the hurricane and were not counted in the official death tolls. So the contrapuntal colors you see here and the textures of the tarp and palm emphasize the seeming contrast between imported goods, like that lantern that you see on the right-hand side of your screen, and on the other hand, the tropical ecology in Puerto Rican culture. The object's colonial history, however, tie them together. Right? We know that FEMA distributed tarps very belatedly and haphazardly in the aftermath of the storm. And here, the blue plastic implies that the shoddy response of the colonial power has made a meteorological regularity into a human disaster. Lindramos's art is a physical manifestation of the Caribbean phenomenon that the Cuban writer Fernando Ortiz called transculturation, right? The process in which cultures from Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Americas are all forcibly thrust together in the archipelago, creating a new culture out of that violence while retaining discrete elements of each. So as much as this is sort of a piece about the history of Puerto Rico, I think it's also a piece about the future of coastal and archipelagic environments, right, in which we're going to see new transculturation happening as a result of climate refugee migration. So here I want to say that Maria engages in these aesthetics, ethics, and practices of salvaging imported materials and transforming them into something new without losing their recognizable and distinct qualities. And in a larger book project, I'm focusing on the ethics and aesthetics of repair and creative regeneration in the Caribbean. So that's where my interest in that comes from. But by juxtaposing this tarp and the coconut in the same installation, Lindramos creatively subsumes the spiraling, repeated injustices of colonialism in Puerto Rico, From both economic and cultural forms of impression, Puerto Ricans make their own sustaining culture. So to conclude, I'll just say the economic and ecological situation for Puerto Ricans on and off the island remains dire. But in a spirit of climate optimism, I propose that these small batch, hyper-local community art projects can have a global reach, right? In creating and reconceptualizing the present and the future of our planet in ways that cultivate flourishing. So I encourage us all to pay attention to public art projects, right? As one public mural in Old San Juan reads, "Los muros hablan cuando la justicia calla y los medios mienten," right? The walls speak when justice falls silent and the media lies. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Jacqueline. Thanks so much, Luis, for the invitation, and Rice for organizing and hosting us. I wish I could be there with all of you, but I just had, like, my wife just had a baby 2 days ago. So you might look at my title and say, well, you should be talking about beginnings rather than endings. But hopefully, you know, the idea is that, like, once we start thinking the figure of the end, we might have new futures, as Charlotte talked about, and as like Sophie did. A pleasure to be in dialogue with Charlotte and Sophie. So hi to both of you. My presentation will be called "In the Ruins of Macondo, the Ends of History and the Returns of Nature." And now I'm going to share my screen. So that should work. Let's see. So we go here. Will take a little bit, but I think we're there. Jacqueline, is it showing? Yeah, I think it is. Good. So, as I said, I'm going to be trying to think about the figure of the end and the figure of the return of nature. And this is a work that is kind of like coming from a book that I recently published last year, which was entitled The Literature of Catastrophe, where indirectly what I'm trying to think through is how natural catastrophes, or at least the figure of the natural catastrophe, allowed Latin American writers and artists throughout the 19th century, particularly, to think through historical events, right? So the 19th century, which sees the rise of the new nation states in Latin America, also saw the rise of the division between nation and culture. But I'm trying to think through how natural catastrophes became a knot where, as Charlotte and Sophie were saying, nature behaved in a way unnaturally, and in doing so open a space of eventuality, a space of politics, a space of historicity. But today I'm fast forward to the 20th century and the rise of a new aesthetics of ruins in the 21st century. Good. So let's begin. In the ruins of Macondo, the end of history and the return of nature. Few phrases seem to resound today with such an empty echo as those two lonely words designating the end. It suffices to enter a bookstore to realize that our society's eschatological fascination with ends and endings seems to be the result of a worrisome crisis itself. The myriad endings we project seem to hint not at any resolution or any final arrival at sense, but rather at the discomfort our society feels with where and how its history is going. Our society seems to be a millenarian society without a prophecy and without a telos. Or, to put it differently, we could say that ours seems to be a society that seems to have forgotten how to punctuate the stories it tells to itself in order to survive. It would seem that today more than ever, we would be in need of a critical apprehension of the figure of the end, not unlike that Frank Kermode produced in his 1967 classic Sense of an Ending. In this sense, at the risk of seeming a little bit outdated or canonical, I would like to begin today by examining a classical ending within Latin American literature and by asking what it would mean today to write after that ending. I'm thinking about the cyclonic ending that wraps up the saga of the Buendía family in Gabriel García Márquez's 100 Years of Solitude. There, as you might remember, in that final scene where the return of nature is staged against the end of the family's history, Garcia Marquez sketches the post-historical landscape that future writers would, in a way, have to tread in their attempt to make sense of history after history's end. In the last chapter, as readers will remember, a scene of reading coincides with the catastrophic ending of the story being told. As Aureliano begins to decipher the manuscripts of the old gypsy Melquiades, he becomes enveloped by a biblical hurricane that tears asunder the world of Macondo. With the spiraling power of the hurricane gusts that turn the winds of progress into a cyclonic whirlwind, the linearity of teleological historicity confuses itself with the circularity of mythological temporality at the same speed with which nature returns to flood history. Nature, that remnant of underdevelopment which José Arcadio Buendía had attempted to master and domesticate through the power of science, returns under different guises to invade the world of culture. We witness a letter being devoured by moths, the clean whistle of the growing weeds inside the Buendía family, the insects that began to overtake Macondo. The old 19th century dichotomies between nature and culture, barbarism and civilization have collapsed. Macondo, the cradle of civilization, the city built in mid-jungle, is slowly being devoured by the voracity of nature as the potent image of the Buendía house invaded by ants eloquently suggests. And I quote, "The rest of the house was given over to the tenacious assault of destruction. The silver shop, Melquiades' room, the primitive and silent realm of Santa Sofía de la Piedad remain in the depths of a domestic jungle that no one would have had the courage to penetrate. Surrounded by the voracity of nature, Aureliano and Amaranta Ursula continue cultivating the oregano and the begonias and defended their world with demarcations of quicklime, building the last trenches in the age-old war between man and ant. In the age-old war between man and ant, nature has been declared winner. Nature has re-emerged with the violent force of the repressed, ready to reduce history to buried ruins. The Latin American 19th century dreams of modernity have been erased by a catastrophic nature that runs loose, invading those landscape gardens where culture seeks to entrench itself. I would like to suggest that for many authors writing in the 1990s and afterwards, in the aftermath of the civil wars that rocked Latin America in the 1970s and 1980s, the literary landscape must have appeared a bit like that described in those final pages of Cien Años de Soledad. With the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the arrival of what Francis Fukuyama infamously called the end of history, writers were left wondering where to salvage or save, as Sophie was suggesting, a sense of historicity within that landscape of ruins that had been bequeathed to them. Within this world in which history was no longer seen as an agent of historical change, nature's return, as prophesied by Garcia Marquez, marked a way of speaking about history after history's end, in ways that echoed Frederick Jameson's famous words, "It is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism." As Jameson goes on to say in that 2003 article, it is a matter of, quote, imagining capitalism by way of imagining the end of the world. A catastrophic paradigm of history then emerges, there where history's end is seen not as the sort of resolution of historical sense or development, but rather as the crisis at the heart of historical sense and historicity itself. Within it, a new poetic arises that sees nature not as a stable sort of ground of representation, namely not as the garden or landscape, but rather as the historical force puncturing the social fabric. Behaving unnaturally, nature finds in the figure of the natural catastrophe a way of voicing out its discontents with modernity. I'm thinking here, for example, of Pedro Mayral's El Año del Desierto, where the citizens of Buenos Aires wake up one day to realize that the Pampa has invaded the city. Or Samantha Schweblin's Asistencia de Rescate, where a poisonous chemical triggers the events told, of the volcanic ashes that fall as the plot of Alia Trabuco Serán's La Resta progresses, of the multiple hurricanes and ecological crises that punctuate the pages of Rita Indiana's La Mucama de Omincule, of the earthquake that the European painter Rugendas wishes to depict or paint in his novelita Un episodio en la vida del pintor viajero. Often, these natural catastrophes are considered to be mere metaphors standing for something else. These reductive approaches, nonetheless, I would say, forget to understand nature in its own right, as a force that destabilizes representation as such, forcing us to consider the complex knot binding nature and culture in Latin America. So instead of perhaps dismissing these catastrophes as mere sort of allegories or metaphors of other aspects of social life, it would be our task as critics today to unearth the historical political entanglement or assemblages, going back to what Charlotte was mentioning, that lies at the heart of this contemporary return of nature. So let's go in that sense back to that scene that has occupied us at the beginning, that which traces the cyclonic ending of Macondo. We have seen how this scene imagines as a sort of nightmare the dreams upon which Latin American history was imagined by our sort of letrado founding figures in the 19th century. We have seen how the divide between nature and culture collapses in a scene that stages the sort of spiraling tension between novelty and repetition, progress and return, history and myth. Namely, by the time Aureliano Babilonia, the last of the Buendia family, catches sight of his pigtailed son being devoured by ants, the cyclone has begun to erode the very foundations of Macondo. And yet, it is then that we, as readers of Garcia Marquez, are reminded of another scene, a scene coming not from an ending, but rather from a beginning, from the very beginning of Garcia Marquez's career as an author, and from the very beginnings of Macondo as a side of his fictions. Namely, the hurricane at the end of 100 Years of Solitude reminds us indeed of the leaf storm that appears in his first novel, La Hojarasca. The cyclonic winds that begin to tear Macondo apart uncannily echo the winds that first helped shape its universe. As readers, we might remember that in the beautiful prologue to his 1955 novella, where Macondo in fact first makes an appearance, its foundation is defined in relationship to the same shattering winds that will end up destroying it. And I quote, "Suddenly, as if a whirlwind had set down roots in the center of the town, the banana company arrived, pursued by a leaf storm." And we can think of this in terms of also the plantation of which Sophie was talking about. A whirling leaf storm had been stirred up, formed out of the human and material dregs of other towns, the chaff of a civil war that seemed ever more remote and unlikely. The whirlwind was implacable. It contaminated everything with its swirling crowd smell, the smell of skin secretion and hidden death. In less than a year, it soughed over the town and the rubble of many catastrophes that had come before it, scattering its mixed cargo of rubbish in the streets. So we could then say that Macondo's foundation is then, from the very get-go, established in relationship to both a discourse of natural catastrophes and a discourse of modernity. The whirlwind arrives alongside the banana company as a sort of Benjaminian storm of progress that will mark its progressive yet catastrophic modernity. Foreshadowing the arrival of the banana company and as its acceleration of time, as it would later appear in 100 Years of Solitude, the prologue defines Macondo as a town composed out of the rubble produced by war. And I'm thinking here about like the sort of assemblages that we saw in the artworks that Charlotte also produced. Macondo, namely, becomes a strange bricolage of nature and culture, whose history begins the day that this foundational leaf storm gets naturalized and the violence of its inaugural state reception becomes second nature. And I quote from Garcia Marquez, from La Hojarasca. Then the train whistled for the first time, the leaf storm turned about and went out to greet it, and by turning it, lost its drive. But it developed unity and mass, and it underwent the natural process of fermentation, becoming incorporated into the germination of the earth. So we could say that this naturalization of its foundational violence is precisely what begins to unravel when, under new hurricane winds, the town's foundation begins to crack. Talking about the authors of the Latin American boom, Doris Sommer notes that their novels sprang from a sort of desire to rewrite and parody the epic subtext of Latin American development, which by the early 1960s had, and I quote her, run aground and made history stumble when it should have been moving forward. Looking back at Latin American history after reaching a precipitous end to find that end no longer meant purpose. In this sense, we could say that the end of 100 Years of Solitude instantiates this crisis regarding the figure of the end understood as the arrival of historical sense. One must not forget that the final scene of 100 Years of Solitude is indeed a scene of reading. Under the image of Aureliano Babilonia, the last living member of the condemned lineage of the Buendia family, deciphering the sense of Melquiades' script, the reader comes to understand something about the novel as a whole. The fact that it must be taken as a sort of rereading and rewriting of Latin American, or at least Colombian history, or Caribbean history. What the final scene that unearths is the tension between competing modes of historicity, as well as the intuition that is precisely this tension that has led us to experience our modernity in a catastrophic manner. As the ants begin to invade the house, turning Macondo into the jungle it once was, Aureliano suddenly realizes that the terrible reality he is beginning to decipher in the manuscripts is precisely that which surrounds him. Understanding his predicament, he sees, amidst the rye grass and spider webs, the body of his dead son being eaten by a battalion of ants. The great nightmare of the 19th century naturalist novel, the prophesied fear of his great-grandmother, has become a reality. Incest has produced a pigtailed kid that is, in that instant, being consumed by nature. Interestingly, it's only then that the code to decrypt the manuscripts of Melquiades is revealed to him, and I quote, "And then he saw the child, it was dry and bloated bag of skin that all the ants in the world were dragging toward their hole along the stone path in the garden. Aureliano could not move, not because he was paralyzed by horror, but because at the prodigious instant, Melquiades' final keys or code were revealed to him, and he saw. So namely, at the sight of his pigtail son being devoured by ants, Aureliano realizes he's a man living at the end of times. However, this end of history is not merely a utopic instant of absolute comprehension, but rather a little bit like in Jorge Luis Borges' short story El Aleph, the catastrophic witnessing of a totality too vast and overwhelming to be experienced synthetically. Overwhelmed, the last of the Buendia family realizes that he's also a victim of this catastrophe of sense. And I quote, "At that point, impatient to know his origin, Aureliano skipped ahead. Then the wind began, warm, incipient, full of voices from the past, the murmurs of ancient geraniums, sighs of disenchantment that preceded the most tenacious nostalgia. He didn't notice it because at that moment he was discovering the first indications of his own being. He was so absorbed that he did not feel the second surge of wind, either as its cyclonic strength tore the doors and windows of their hinges, pulled off the roof of the east wing, and uprooted the foundations. Under the spiraling logic of the hurricane winds, echoes of the leaf storm which gave rise to Macondo, Garcia Marquez stages a world in which the end of history does not coincide, as Francis Fukuyama's interpretation of Hegel would have it, with the realization of the triumph of progressive modernity and the arrival of a homogeneous liberal state. Rather, what we encounter is a catastrophe that sort of unearths the history of Macondo as a history of violence, destroyed by the same progressive logic of development that is suggested by the winds of the biblical cyclone. Namely, the end of history seen not as the arrival of sense and the liberation from the barbarism of nature, namely not as the act of revelatory uncovering suggested by the word apocalypse, but rather as a traumatic confrontation with the barbaric origins of our dreams of modernity. So, to conclude, if, as Ernst Bloch said, every epoch dreams the one to come, it could be said that this ending marks a sort of painful moment of awakening, the instant in which Latin American finally wakes up to realize its dreams of modernity were in fact nightmares. Every epoch dreams of itself as being annihilated by catastrophes. Adorno's reformulation of Bloch's motto, later adopted by Walter Benjamin as part of his arcade projects, gains a prophetic tone within Garcia Marquez's novels. Not only, as Aureliano Babilonia soon comprehends, due to the fact that Melquiades's manuscripts already foretells the story of Macondo's catastrophic dissolution, but rather because the novel tragically presaged the political disaster that, in the form of right-wing market-espousing military dictatorships, would rocket the continent in the decades to follow. Published in 1967, Cien Años de Soledad already foreshadows the historical storm, which, in the name of progress and democracy, would soon lead to the devastating disappearance of more than 100,000 Latin Americans. The image of Aureliano Babilonia struggling to find any sort of meaning within the ruins of Melquiades's archive would soon become a recognizable one. Ravished by nature and destroyed in the name of modernity, our letter cities would soon turn into archives of ruins, among whose vestiges the writer would have to wander in search of those fragments of meaning which might help piece together the sense of a history that had been reduced to ashes. The authors writing in the wake of such catastrophes would have the task of unearthing these ruins where nature and culture wrap around each other like poisonous ivy. Thanks so much.
And I want to ask the audience if they have any question. This was wonderful. All these presentations were so really refreshing to hear. And while everybody kind of get ready for a question, I want to just ask everybody, the three of you, something that kind of will be more geared towards the audience that is coming from different backgrounds and different disciplines. And I was wondering, in all these cases, you all talk about this idea of what you mentioned, Sophie, which is the unlivable geography, which is due to either plantation of or extraction policies. And I was wondering if all of you could talk a little bit, and I'm watching the audience, but I'm talking to Charlotte, and I'm talking to Carlos, and I'm talking to Sophie, but it's just a little bit disorienting. But if you could talk a little bit about the negotiations that today take place, either in art, literature, or writing, in generally speaking, or other practices to restore, reheal, reclaim, and reverse these politics. Kind of like trying to think more in a way of thinking of not solutions, but trying to think more about kind of how can we move forward, right? We see this end of nature, and we have to define nature. That's a very complicated term, but we talk about water, we're talking about the palm tree as a sign of identity in the context of Puerto Rico, and then we're talking about all these unlivable geographies in the case of literature that Carlos has named. So what are the negotiations that can be placed in order to move forward in a more rehealing, reclaiming, and reverting, right? Just because we want to resist and we want to change. So I don't know who wants to start. Sophie, I see you.
Sure. I'm right here, so I guess I'll start.
Maybe you can use this.
Yeah. Is that
Yes.
okay? So I don't know. I mean, I could answer this in like a pretty positive way, but I don't think that that would be just to the actual situation. So I have some sort of healing focused comments to respond to what Gisela said, but also I want to note, you know, people in the region where I work in Haiti depend increasingly on food aid. It's massively subsidized and it's the cheapest thing at the market. So even people whose families have farmed for centuries eat primarily imported foods or foods provided to them by NGOs and church groups that are focused on maintaining their position in the region. And that's not a very hopeful response to what Gisela said, but you know, I mentioned unlivable geographies, but of course people still live there and they will continue to live there as long as they can, and they're doing what they can to stay alive. And so increasingly farming is not a tenable way to live in this area. That's partly due to climate change, it's partly due to food insecurity, it's partly due to migration and other social and political pressures that cause people to not be able to work on their land. I do say their land because most people do own their land in the region where I work. And that's something that I think is particular about this part of Haiti, is that most people have been landowners for several centuries and they're not about to give up their land, and they will defend it, and they have defended it. And so at the very least, they have their land. You know, I mentioned men migrating to the Dominican Republic or elsewhere, and in relation to that, many women have stayed in the region where I work, near Ash in central Haiti. And women have not traditionally worked farm plots. They've worked kitchen gardens and the areas around the home where they've helped at harvest times, but they haven't been the primary farmers. And now they're beginning to be the primary farmers on the land that the family owns, or to engage in sharecropping or land leasing in areas that do get more water or that are more climate resilient, and they are selling cash crops at the market in a way that they haven't before. So I'd say if we think about it in terms of gender, this really tragic and extremely detrimental change in the social structure has led to women taking on a role that they hadn't previously. Not going to judge that as a good thing or a bad thing, but they're surviving and picking up new techniques.
Wonderful, thank you. Maybe Carlos or Charlotte? Yes.
Sure. Thank you very much, Gisela, for that question. And I think that one common theme in all three of our talks was about the idea of inhabiting ruins, right? The creation of, capitalist ruins. It's very nice in a novel to be able to end the story with a cyclone that wipes out the town. But as Sophie was saying, there's a lot of Caribbean lived experience and Latin American lived experience is about inhabiting the ruins. And I think that might be a good lesson for the rest of us who live on a mainland or in coastal areas with the current and coming effects of climate change. So we see, how did we get into this situation? I think all three of us have talked about sort of colonial capitalism and dependencies, and I don't want to use any more buzzwords. I think we really know what the problems are here. So Gisela's question is about the solutions, right? If we look at places like the island of Vieques in Puerto Rico, which was used as a bombing range, by the US government for 60 years and now has soils that are too toxic to cultivate, right? Or the mass migrations of peoples in and out of Puerto Rico, depending on capitalist policies about workers, right? So what we see here is a constant imposition of a colonial power on an island. So in the case of Puerto Rico, what I'm seeing now in terms of regeneration and in terms of solutions is very small batch hyper local projects that involve craft. And so craft in multiple senses of that word, like the idea of creating something skillfully by hand, becomes both a sort of psychological way of healing from trauma in the aftermath of hurricanes, but it also becomes a very physical way to resist the economies and global forces that are working and have constantly worked against peoples of the Caribbean. So just to sum up, I think that we can look to the peoples of Caribbean cities in particular on how to inhabit ruins and how to work towards collaborative survival with other peoples and with the animals and with the landscape entirely. That's something that Anna Singh talks about in some of her works, like The Mushroom at the End of the World. So yeah, thank you. And Carlos, I'd love to hear, we have a lot to talk about with, the way that catastrophe unearths injustice, but I'd love to hear your answer to the question.
Yeah, thanks, Charlotte, and thanks so much, Gisela, for the question. Charlotte, I think you pointed out something that was crucial when you were talking about Lindramos's work, and you were talking about this sort of assemblage, sort of like aesthetic that kind of like builds from the debris or the ruins that have like been left behind, and constructs within that what Rosie would, for example, Sophie would call a sort of shelter, right? A space that might be precarious in the case of, like, for example, the tarp, the blue tarp that we know so well in Puerto Rico, but some space, some sort of like, shelter space where a new sense of futurity could like begin to emerge. And, from my talk, like, it always can sound like I'm very catastrophic and apocalyptic, but I think that the question would be precisely that, like, once like the storm has passed, how is it that like writers or artists can like work with that debris or that leader and kind of like construct like assemblages that like could position us in like ways that we could imagine at least some sense of futurity after this sort of like after the end of this like narratives of modernity, of development, and so on, and a sense of futurity that like is an alternative one to those models, right? So that would be a little bit my answer. And of course, every single art form works in a different way depending on the medium. In my case, I usually work with fictions, right? And clearly, like, the future is the biggest fiction of them all. So hypothetically, we need fictions, but healthy ones in a way.
Yeah. No, I just a comment on the side. I'm thinking of fiction. I don't know if you can hear me because I'm moving but I'm also taking into account what Charlotte said about art is action. So fiction could be action. So just not because, it's representation doesn't mean that it could not turn into something that, that goes beyond the boundaries of mediation and becomes something in itself. So that's why I was thinking of literature and art as well as, kind of providing a way of thinking of how to kind of reheal and reclaim all of these inhabit and devastated landscapes. Do we have one more? Okay.
Questions in the chat.
Let me.
One question.
We're gonna. Okay, here's a question. Hold on. Here, I have a question about damnificado. This is for you, Sophie. In the context of Central American post-war period, Erika Aguirre has written that gente en la posguerra. Well, I don't know if you speak Spanish. No. So the people in the post-war lives in a permanent state of being damned because of war. So she wants to know what did you ever thought about that figure in the context of your research, I guess? And then also another question for Carlos. Have you thought about Lawrence Whitehead's ideas on Latin America's mausoleum of modernity and the literary landscape of Latin America? So we have two questions. I don't know if Sophie, you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, I can't necessarily speak to the Latin American context more broadly, having worked most specifically on Haiti. But I do I guess I'll take the question very literally and just say that the typical narratives about Haiti very much portray it as a place that is cursed, and that the people are somehow cursed as a retribution for their revolution against the plantation system. And I think, I don't know, I think it's strange to put it in the context of post-war Latin America, because Haiti's revolution was several hundred years ago, right? But it's been a constant state of occupation and reoccupation, both formal and informal, since then. And there have been coups followed by occupations. And this is partly why I don't write about those political struggles specifically, because I'm interested in what it is that people who are survivors, who have survived for many hundreds of years, the kind of world that they make.
Mhm, mhm. This idea of being cursed, right? When in our class on environmental justice, we talk about Africa, Nigeria, and all these places with a lot of resources. They feel that, just because they're so much, they have so much resources and richness in all different ways, has been a constant source and object of lootings, and that is kind of recurrent.
I will just add, in every occupation of Haiti, some formal or not, some resource is taken from the country. So whether that's young people, or whether that is water that is moved to other places around the country, or timber, all the tropical hardwoods that were present when the island was colonized, gold, oil, natural gas, right? The rich soils of the tropical climate. So something is taken every time.
Yeah. Any other question in the audience? Yes, Joe?
Yeah, and project. If I project, it'll help. Okay, I really enjoyed the panel. Thank you so much. I want to ask a question about models of collaboration, which I started thinking about during Charlotte Rogers' paper, and I'm thinking about it in new ways because of all the other papers and because of Gisela's comments too. I'm just wondering if there's an after the end, if there are ways of dismantling plantation as a system that still operates, right? And if there are ways of thinking about living on after disaster, they depend on forms of collaboration, right? Some of which are very ancient, some of which are happening now, some of which maybe we still need to imagine. So I just love to hear from each of the speakers. I was thinking about the studio as a certain model. I'm thinking about how everywhere in the humanities lab is becoming an interesting kind of model and sort of metaphor for collaboration. I'm just wondering if you could talk a bit about forms of collaboration that come out of the disciplines that you all work in, which are sort of wonderfully overlapping, but also distinct. Charlotte, do you want to go?
Yeah, sure. I can address that a bit because I am, in fact, a member of a lab here at the University of Virginia that works on coastal futures and brings together scientists and artists there. So I think that there is, in some ways, a recognition across universities that we need a fundamentally interdisciplinary approach to addressing the contemporary disasters of all kinds, and particularly climate change. I've been fortunate to be part of some of those conversations at the University of Virginia, but I'm not overly optimistic in the sense that at a recent meeting, we gathered together lots of scientists, social scientists, humanities scholars, and thinking about investing up to $50 million at the University of Virginia in climate resilience. And the vice provost specifically asked if, instead of actually doing work in communities with affected populations, was there a role for artificial intelligence to enable us to monitor people's living in coastal areas and understand what they were going through and therefore solve their problems? And so, I think I gave an answer that was about, the dangers of the panopticon and the importance of actually doing work with communities. And so I feel that the humanities are frequently being sidelined in these supposedly interdisciplinary conversations. So I have some skepticism about our current university models, which is why I have worked, I think, as I talked about in my intro, about the importance of funding artists on the islands, funding writers on the islands or in the coastal areas as a way of really paying attention to the communities. And I think that is probably our biggest challenge confronting climate change. It's not technological, it's political, and it's social, and it's about overcoming prejudice. That's my soapbox speech. So no, you cannot use artificial intelligence to solve climate change. That's my idea. Carlos, I imagine you have a few things to say too.
Thanks, Charlotte. No, it's interesting. Like I keep going back to this idea of yours of like, you know, kind of like poetics of assemblages, in the sense that not only the artworks themselves are they like, you know, kind of like put together in like in a way that like resembles an assemblage, but like the idea of assemblage or things coming together that don't usually like come together is like quite interesting, like with regards to like kind of post-catastrophe sort of like responses. And in my case, I see like very, you know, very personally with what happened in Puerto Rico. I'm half Puerto Rican. I grew up there all my entire life, and I saw it like with Maria, that like there was a sense of like art. Not only is art now political, like it has always been, but it's always done in collaboration, right? And these assemblages or these collectivities that emerge. You mentioned Beta Local, for example. You mentioned like Lindramos's project. I think you know, started emerging like much more clearly. I did see like a lot of like, you know, US like universities like being very aware of this. Like I remember like Princeton opened like 2 positions with for like visiting artists, a little bit what you mentioned, Charlotte, with Coast in Crisis. And even me particularly, like my own experience was a little bit along those lines. So like, you know, writers, we usually tend to be like quite lonely and we just write ourselves. But the only time that I have done ever a collaboration was in a short story in which I reflected upon the aftermath of Maria, where I did a collaboration with an architect friend of mine to try to think of like, you know, these questions of ruins and everything. So even indirectly, like I can't say much more than that or what that meant, but it was the only time in which like I jumped kind of frontiers and started collaborating or thinking of collectivity.
I really enjoyed you guys. So thank you everyone for joining us for this fabulous panel. I'd really like to thank Carlos Fonseca and Charlotte Rogers. We have to do it again. You have to come here and then we'll hang out and we'll talk about things and collaborate with no artificial intelligence, only our great brains. So we'll stop here. People who are with us will just enjoy the day and have lunch. We hope that you will come and join us again at 2:30 for the other session, or come back and join us tomorrow, because tomorrow is also going to be exciting. Thanks for your patience with technology. I'm still learning, okay, and I'm not that gifted, but I just want to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlotte, and thank you, Carlos. It was really a pleasure. Thank you, Sophie, of course. Thank you, Jacqueline, and thank you to the audience for being here.